First of all, welcome. For some of you, it might be the first presentation that you are joining for ODR Cyber Week, the 27th year that we've done this by the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution with our friends and colleagues from all over the world. And for those of you that have already participated, thank you. Some of the people who are in this room are presenting later in the week, so I hope you'll get a good look at the calendar and the program and see there are a lot of wonderful demos coming up, opportunities to hear about activities that are happening in Nigeria and Brazil and Spain and England and Canada and Argentina and China and many places around the world. So we're really glad that you're here. And I am thrilled to have been a co-author of this book, and I'm going to turn it over to Dan, who is the series editor.
Thank you, Leah. So what we're going to do is sort of run through the major ideas in the book and hopefully have more of a dialogue than anything else, be able to talk back and forth with you, answer questions and whatnot. So I'm going to kick it off and I'm going to share my screen because, of course, you can't exist these days without slides. Have to have slides. And so we'll, a little bit later on, Leah's going to post a discount code. I don't think it's speaking out of school to say that we're sort of shocked by the price of this book, but there's a discount code that she'll post a little bit later on. And so I've just got some opening thoughts, and so I'm going to be relatively short and leave my colleagues a good bit of time to talk about the information that they talked about in the chapters that they wrote. Um, so one of the first things that you ask when you start working on something like a book is, why am I doing this? And particularly, why am I doing it now? And what I have on the right there on the graphic is heaven and hell. And they represent pretty much the way people have been talking about artificial intelligence. It's either going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread, it's going to save us all, it's going to cure diseases, it's going to be this wonderful thing, or it's going to kill us all. And so there's a lot of discussion on both ends of the spectrum. We suspect that the reality is somewhere in between, but it's not difficult to find the heaven and the hell, excuse me, aspects of the discussion about, pardon me, artificial intelligence. Um, there's there's a point of view that comes from a Nobel laureate from 2024, physics Nobel laureate, that I think is interesting to deal with, and one of the reasons why we wrote this book. Um, Jeffrey Hinton says that the impact of AI is going to be comparable to the impact of the Industrial Revolution. Um, Essentially, what he argues is that we've accommodated the notion that we have machines that are stronger than we are, but we've never had experience of what it's like to have things that are smarter than us, and that's where we're headed, and that's going to have a huge impact. And one of the things that we had in mind when the four of us got together and started talking about this is that uh, there has to be some way to have some controls or some governance mechanism that will work with artificial intelligence. And so we started off by asking a simple question: can we govern AI? Can we as a society govern AI? And the answer, if you're talking about being able to keep bad things from happening, is a very hard no. It really is axiomatic that bad actors are going to act badly no matter what you do, no matter what you put in place to stop them. And the development of AI so far has been open enough that there's enough tools out there that even if you shut things down now, there's still enough out there so that bad actors can do whatever they want to do. And we're already overrun, as I say here, with AI fakes, damaging false information, AI material that is influencing political campaigns, et cetera. So if you think about governing artificial intelligence in the sense of putting boundaries up that are hard, that keep people from doing things that are destructive, we don't think that's possible. However, if you define governance as the ability to put sufficient information out there for developers and potential users of AI so that if they have in mind operating ethically, they know what that means. So that there are guidelines for developers that say, look, this is what an ethical user of AI is going to be looking for when they're trying to figure out which AI program to use. And if you can put that information in the hands of in the case of Leah and for me, dispute resolution professionals, that says, okay, you should be looking for these things in the AI that you're about to purchase and use if you want to operate ethically. If we can do those things, then people of goodwill will have guidelines and will have um, some sense of what it means to operate ethically and to develop ethically. And so we think if you look at governance in that light, then it is possible to have some notion of governance. Um, it's my contention, and I'm not sure that my colleagues completely agree with me, that the marketplace eventually is going to have a lot to do with whether or not ethical development of AI is there. There are now and will continue to be even more targeted AI programs for various professional uses. And if if there are sufficiently clear guidelines for what one should be looking for as a professional who's going to use AI, then that will give you a reason to choose one over the other. And if you have two developers, one of whom says, we don't really care what they think, we're going to develop what we want, and the other who says, this is what they say is going to be workable for them in their marketplace, we're going to build to that, then I think hopefully the one that's building to the marketplace is going to succeed, and that's going to some degree help govern how AI is developed and used. So that's essentially the grounding, the background of the discussions that we had about whether we can govern AI or not. What we came up with and what we believe is there are three important domains that you have to take into consideration when you talk about the notion of governance. One is to some degree government as opposed to governance, and that is law and regulation. And Chris is going to talk about this. And he's going to talk about law and regulation, especially as it relates to the safety aspect of developing AI. The second domain is international standards. The third domain is professional standards, and Leah will talk about that when she has her part of the conversation today. So law and regulation, there's some positives and negatives to all of these. Law and regulation is bound by borders, and it's enforceable inside those borders, but outside those borders, not so much. The EU is probably a leader in producing. I skipped ahead too far. Sorry about that. Um, the the EU is a leader in developing law and regulation, but there are other laws and regulations that have been developed as well. In Italy, about a month ago, they passed a law that said that someone who uses artificial intelligence and damages another person has committed a felony. Now, that's an interesting take on things, and if you happen to be in Italy and you want to enrich a lawyer, that would be one thing that you might use to do so. But outside of Italy, it's meaningless. And so law and regulation, as you enact it, is enforceable within boundaries, but it's bound by those borders. Generally, they're targeted on harm, which will sort of speak to what Chris is going to talk about in terms of safety. They're voluntary outside those borders, and they're usually behind the curve. And the example that I've used before with this is that um, the EU passed a set of EU regulations about 6 months or so before ChatGPT hit. And before ChatGPT hit, the person who was in charge of putting those regulations together basically said, these are terrific regulations and they're going to stand the test of time. And the test of time was 2 months, between 2 and 6 months. So they're usually behind the curve, and they're difficult to develop in the first place, and they're difficult to maintain in terms of currency. So there are positive things and there are some drawbacks. The second domain is international standards. The good thing about them is that they cross borders. Um, they're voluntary outside across those borders, but they cross borders. They tend to be market driven, but on the other side of that, it's a lengthy process. And if you talk about developing something like an ISO standard, it can take years to do that. And whether you want to admit it or not, they're politically influenced, and there's a lot of give and take, and which countries are willing to go for which types of standards. So international standards can be very helpful, and Leah will talk about this when she gets to her part of the discussion. But there are also some drawbacks to international standards. And the final domain that we talked about is professional standards. the professional standards, like the ones that you would have for mediators, for arbitrators, for lawyers, for engineers, for other kinds of professions that would use artificial intelligence, the good thing about them is that they cross borders and they carry a lot of weight within the professions. And so they may be not enforceable in the same way law and regulation is, but within professions, they carry a lot of weight. They're generally targeted to a specific use, so they can be very, very focused on what's ethical in your part of the world. It's normally a much shorter process to develop those, and they're usually much more easily adapted than international standards or law and regulation. So what we argue is that if you take any one of those domains and try to do any governance of artificial intelligence using only one of those domains, you're probably working in an impossible situation. However, our basic argument is that if you take all three of those, if you have reasonable law and regulation that address things that are safety issues and other things that are appropriate for law and regulation, if you have international standards that are adopted by many countries, and if you have professional standards that are very focused on the work of a particular set of people, then you have all of that together. All three combines have a chance to, within some bounds, offer some governance of artificial intelligence. So that, let me stop sharing for a moment. That's essentially the setup. That's what we talked about before we wrote this book, and that's what we tried to look at as we were putting together the pieces of this book. And what I'd like to do at this point is turn it over to Chris and ask him to give us a little background on the notion of law and regulation and the safety aspects of trying to govern artificial intelligence. So, Chris, take it away.
It- Thank you very much, and hopefully everyone can see the screen here. One of the I think one of the biases is probably important to identify about me is when we talk about smart with respect to these tools, my belief that smart can almost be framed as the ability for the tool to be mimicking humans fast and the humans can understand how they're being mimicked. So when you look at it from that perspective of what we're approaching with AI, the big question is first within regulation standards or anything else is what is it? And I think we have to be very clear that there are not ghosts in the machine. And a lot of what we see as human interpretation oftentimes was put there by those interpreting it. These are important considerations we need to look at when we're talking about how do we regulate from a strategic perspective? How do we regulate from scope and approach to it, which is what we're discussing in the chapters that we have. In chapter one, we sort of lay out the fact that we have to be clear that AI fundamentally takes information and creates data out of that observation through the filtration, its bias and capabilities to build a model from which that model, if it doesn't know something, is able to say, this range of stuff could be right and ends up with an outcome that isn't wrong. As anyone who has been in a relationship knows, being right and being not wrong are not the same. And if we find ourselves not wrong too often, we are diverging quite rapidly and exponentially from truth. That will and has already been observed to be happening here. So we need to understand that the tool itself is not a traditional product, is not something that looks the exact same thing every way. And it cannot be separated from the humans that it is amplifying and accelerating. In many ways, AI is more of an exoskeleton than it is a product, is inseparable from the individual, and has two primary components that will always be in every one of these learning-based systems, which is I'll have a brain, a probabilistic brain that will, as a function of how much training data it has, will have a different level, a different certain level of uncertainty within it. And it'll have a series of libraries from which, if it understands the problem correctly, will pull the right book. But exactly like a kindergartner in a college, in a kindergartner in a university library, my answers are going to be restricted to my ability to train to the size of my training. Similarly, if I put an astrophysicist in a kindergarten classroom, I'm not going to be able to explain space without, without pictures. these realizations of what components are driving what are very, very important as we understand how should we look at this tool, but more importantly, how should we look at the threats of this tool? Because the threats of AI aren't necessarily the machine, the threats are human. As I said with smartness, you know, this tool is at the end of the day a mimic. And the question is, what is it mimicking for the purpose of accelerating and amplifying human action? And its risks come down to how well is it able to do that relative to our ability to understand it. The AI tools have what we consider a spew speed, which is how quickly can you create something that looks human that will then, if it is not identified as being wrong, will develop its own synthetic realities as a function of its reasoning, as a function of its amount of data that it has. And this spew speed, the ability for it to create something that looks human, faster than we can track it, based off of its synthetic reality as a function of its reasoning or its constitutions, is where the real true threat is. The threat is not in the thing being fundamentally dangerous. It's in our ability to control it. In the book, we go through our typical approaches of in the loop, on the loop, out of the loop strategies, but most of these tools we're building fundamentally turn into on the loop systems, i.e., ones that the human using it is a tool that is supposed to jump in if it's wrong. The challenge being as that tool starts to get going, and if it's making not wrong choices, the human can only catch up so quickly to figure out that something is really amiss, and that machine is already off into no man's land. This is the biggest danger of that tool of every type. I think I sat earlier in a session with Claire, and I thought her presentation was very good. The tools that she was presenting on are very interesting. And with each one of them, the level of how far the tool can get away varied. The method by which she identified when she had sufficient control over that tool was something that in her mind was very, very clear. And all of us need to be very clear as we're using these tools, especially in these legally sensitive environments, of what is that distance that is going to be created between when this system is moving and when we're able to know that it's going the wrong direction on us. This is sort of the core ethos of how we are approaching within this book the concept of safety. Now, I believe in a lot of ways that the EUAI Act is good. I believe in a lot of ways it's probably not as out of touch as some have claimed it is, because I do think the positives of the EUAI Act are that it does have a focus on the human. It does have a focus on the informational nature of this tool. And I do think fundamentally what the Act identifies is what we argue here, which has been the belief of what safety is for generations in ultra hazardous systems, which is that safety is the iterative reduction in the probability or consequence of any negative outcome. My argument I would identify is that it's responsible. We are being responsible with AI if we are if we are being ethical with it. Ethical is that if you can make something safer, that you must. And safety, again, comes down to, am I reducing the chance of a negative outcome or the size of a negative outcome from occurring until we're at an ethical level? As far as what an ethical level is, we walk through in the book that an ethical level has been defined for now, over 30 years in actual US government regulations, for over 60 years conceptually in these areas of aerospace, petrochemical, nuclear. And our argument is we should be applying this to AI. It is the exact same type of ultra hazard system that we see in other areas. We have threats and we have these risks. And if we're able to take this framing that we have agreed to in other regulatory environments, we should be able to actually simplify the problem we're dealing with. We should be able to come through with true, meaningful regulations that will be able to adapt, similar to the core of what's in the EUAI Act, even though its arbitrary classifications are where I think many people have a lot of their challenges, because both the EUAI Act and this approach that we've seen with ultra hazardous systems is able to identify that, number one, we can't separate the human action from the regulation. And we need to, in the purpose and in the scope of this regulation, focus on the biases held by the creators and the biases that are still ingrained in and unable to be removed from these systems. Regulation in this area, I would strongly argue, is that it must be outcome based. It must be looking at, is the outcome appropriate? And when you're looking at AI, the challenge is not a digital sovereignty problem like we see in other spaces. The challenge when we were arriving in the COVID era was, is the data that is going to be unmodified is the data that's going to remain exactly the same is going to be released? Is my video data, which will be unmodified, going to be accessible to other individuals inappropriately? Is my written word going to be accessible to other individuals inappropriately? That is a world where we can protect the users by protecting the data itself. That is not what we have with AI. AI is more akin to the problem we originally saw with respect to YouTube. We need to focus on whether or not whether or not the tool's outcome is correct. Something that we may calibrate for California may not be roadworthy in Michigan. In the same way, with YouTube, what we saw was YouTube in itself is not bad. It's whether or not the employee is spending all day on cat videos. It is whether or not, it turns out with the pandemic, every city was using YouTube for their city meetings. The tool itself isn't bad, but the information that calibrated it for the purpose of its use is what must be continually being examined. And when we're regulating these tools, we must be, again, looking to these uses to figure out, are they appropriate? In Chapter 3, we step through this and look through regulations that are going to be, and look at how we would regulate as a function of use case. The question isn't, is this tool built in the right way? Does it have the right safeties? Because that part is undefinable. If I, for example, am going to regulate a gun only has 3 mechanical ways of which it is going to be safed. And once I decide it must be safed, it will do the exact same process every single time to arrive at a known safe state. With AI, I'm looking at, once the tool interprets that I'm asking you to safe it, it is going to, within a suitable level of uncertainty, give you a safe state, but it will do it the same. It will do it every single time exactly uniquely. That's a very, very, very different tool. And when we start regulating, we must be using this risk framework and asking the more important questions in our regulation, as we do in Chapter 3, questions like, the AI's limits should be bounded by their application and use. The questions we should be asking is, who pays for the environmental damage of AI? How addictive should we allow something to be? Who's allowed to monopolize information? What is too dangerous to sell? How should we balance transparency and risk sharing? When is someone's identity stolen? These are the questions that we can actually ask within regulation, and this must be our focus with a tool like AI that is so fundamentally amorphous. Because if we take that approach and we take that risk-based regulatory approach towards this tool as a function of the outcomes it creates, we may not know what those regulations exactly look like, but we do know how we'll get there. And we do know with these other ultra hazardous approaches what that path towards regulation is going to look like itself. What we mean by that is, when we're looking at other ultra hazardous technologies, and we're seeing this already, we start with really, regulation through lawsuits or arbitration. We look at places where the law isn't clear and someone feels their harm, and we duke that out in the court. That phase of this development towards performance-based native regulation lasts until the insurance companies, the regulators of last resorts in the free market regulators, if you will, until they say, hey, well, based on all these court cases, this is where we believe the boundaries are. Once the insurance companies step in, now we usually see the government now develops a strategy, hopefully, that's consistent with waiving in a thoughtful manner certain requirements in that area. From then, we start incorporating other standards that by that time, now that we've had enough of these cases adjudicated that the insurance company weighs in, that we sort of know which rules don't work, we can start to say, here's the standards that we can start to incorporate into our regulations before we reach that internationally coordinated native or performance-based native regulation phase, which I think we can probably all argue in the United States is years and years off from where we are right now. We will be stuck for a long time in the, regulate through lawsuit or arbitration mode. And I think if we're talking about how do we move ourselves down this progression, how do we move ourselves towards a productive place where we are going to be protecting the public from the dangers of these tools while ensuring innovation as possible, we need to start thinking about what are those strategic actions within this phase of our within this phase of our journey that are going to be able to move the ball forward towards where we want to go. For example, how when we're thinking about labor relations, one of our big questions is what is the highest value case we should be thinking about that can actually get the fundamental questions that are risks within AI talked about. I would argue one of those is looking at when are we stealing people, especially in this gig economy. We're looking at arbitrators, mediators. The question of what is legal work being done by the machine has always been a question for years. If we're looking more broadly in labor, and we're looking more broadly at what are those instances where we have right now legal lack of clarity in our contracts that could be exploited for us to have some of these hard decisions, labor's a good one to start. If we look at programmers, for example, many lawyers believe, as does many of the general public, that we want to be translating law into code because code has patterns in it. But code is so much similar to law that we don't really appreciate it. Just like law, where we're taking paragraphs and modifying them for the appropriate outcome, code is the exact same. That ability to take standard language and modify it to be appropriate for use is that unique IP. It's that unique skill. What separates someone who's just an associate from a partner. It's someone that separates a junior coder from a skilled architect within that space. That ability to actually mimic the thoughts and the actions and how those people do that was never able to be copied before. And in that environment where we could never copy it before, every single contract had two clauses that are incredibly important. The first was that every work you do for us is work for hire. If I do it for you, you told me to do it, I hand it over to you, it's yours, I don't make claims to it. The balancing clause was we will not claim any ownership over your ability to create this. We will not claim any ownership over your unique intellectual property. But now every single time I'm putting my code into a code repository that's monitored by AI, I'm attempting and I am actively stealing that essence. I'm actively stealing that pattern, that ability, that pattern that exists and how that code is created. You're stealing that economic opportunity for that contractor to do more work elsewhere. And we're seeing it already in starting salaries for young coders going from mid six figures down to less than 90 grand. We're seeing this happening. We're seeing this damage, and we're arguing within the book that we should be looking at our laws from the perspective of what are we trying to protect the public from in the face of this innovation. And I would argue, why isn't that a mass arbitration effort to start to get more of these clear injustices into the space of discussion towards our end outcome, which is unified native and appropriate regulation. So with that, obviously our next step along that path, once we start to hit some of these lawsuits, start to hit some of these insurance places, we can actually start to develop the standards that are going to be used in the next phase, which is where I'll hand over to Leah for a really great discussion on relative to ODR, where that standard work has been making real major gains in this space.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to pick up right there. Speaking specifically about international online dispute resolution standards and AI. And for this audience, since we're gathering for the purpose of paying attention to access to justice, the incorporation of technology into mediation, arbitration, facilitation, negotiation, courts, in particular this week, hopefully this will resonate and stimulate some discussion among my colleagues as we explore kind of our arena where so many of us are doing this work. But in the chapter placed within the rest of the book, the thing I want to highlight both at the beginning and at the end of the presentation is the fact that I think that we'd argue that so often professions and disciplines spend time developing standards that can be jurisdiction bound. So if you look at some disciplines like engineering, there have been successful creations of international standards for engineers, just as an example with IEEE. But for many disciplines, they're specific to a particular region, a particular legal jurisdiction, for who can mediate in a particular court setting, or what the certification is for people who are going to pass a bar in a particular country, or get a social work license, just as an example. So standards are often, when they're profession or discipline specific, inside a silo that is also inside of a particular legal jurisdiction. And the benefit of having international standards, as was mentioned earlier by Daniel, is the fact that they can cross these boundaries, but they're also extremely difficult to navigate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways in which we have seen the development of online dispute resolution standards that now include AI bridge both of these, or another way I'd like to talk about is kind of disrupt these two ways of considering governing. So international standards that are developed inside of a discipline or inside of a profession can contribute more broadly to AI governance when they're designed to be relevant beyond its silo. And since dispute resolution serves all sectors, all aspects of society, Chris gave us the example of labor. We also have family, we have environmental, we have healthcare, just as a couple of the examples, commerce. And then we also have legal jurisdictions. Since dispute resolution is needed and utilized in all sectors and across all boundaries, then the creation of ODR standards that include AI, we specifically were interested in designing them to address this reality. So often we talk about technology and AI as disruptive innovation. And since AI has disrupted these boundaries, whether they're legal jurisdictions or ways in which we're used to communicating, and disrupt the way that we teach and we learn, disrupt the way that we argue and fight, disrupt the way that we create and contribute. ODR standards were specifically, thoughtfully attempted to be developed in a way that would follow this AI disruption and not be trapped inside the traditional box about the way governance often gets off the ground. Since AI magnifies opportunities and risks to access to justice, we saw a real urgency in including AI in ODR standards. I'm just going to highlight a couple of the more commonly discussed areas of risks and benefits before I proceed with talking about the ODR standards and the way that we've integrated AI into them. One thing we did pay attention to carefully was the fact that so often standards are, in effect, the basement. They're the floor. Below that is what is unacceptable. And they're set up as these guardrails, as Daniel mentioned earlier, guardrails in order to prevent behavior that is unproductive, destructive, creates liabilities or create harm. But we also wanted to create that floor, so to speak, to say, since we're interested in access to justice or in other phrasing that might fit better with other forms of dispute resolution that are less focused on justice and more on healing, relationship repair, relationship building, restoration of relationship, that we wanted to highlight what that floor could look like where we were encouraging people to access the benefits for dispute handling. So here are just a few, which many of you, of course, will be familiar with, a few of the ways that AI can enhance access to justice with a lot of emphasis on efficiency and capability. It can assist us to handle cases, to participate, to resolve them much more fast, much more cost effectively, help us assist with many more parties, help us with extremely complex cases, especially if we think about large-scale public policy disputes or disputes that have widespread impact due to healthcare or environmental issues, just as an example, with many, many different types of both stakeholders, disputants, and also visions of what the future outcome can look like. AI can help us with creative visioning, both in text and in visuals, and the use of machine learning and AI to help generate that can assist us, as I mentioned, also with creativity and managing far more data. It also can help us reduce the need for human intervention. And I recognize the flip side of that can also be an argument that at times can be a risk. But there are many times in which the deployment of AI reducing human intervention can be of benefit to the parties involved. And it can assist not only with resolution, but also early detection of the potentiality of the growth of a dispute, or to provide warning signs that dispute is already underway. And this can assist to resolve things earlier or to prevent. So the positive impact of AI in dispute resolution, I think, illustrates productive disruption, and therefore the governance mechanisms ought to foster AI for public good. And then the impacts of AI in dispute resolution, again, across jurisdictions, within jurisdictions, across all sectors of society, we are already facing many of them, and here are just a few highlights. The fact that there are hallucinations, where something that is not factual, it's inaccurate, it is due to poor collection of data, misunderstanding of the data, misuse of the data, the compounding and the embeddedness of inaccuracies as LLMs are sucking up data and then producing information that people are using in court cases, are using for policy development, that are being relied upon as if they are facts. And another issue I want to raise that I think that there's not as much discussion about as we would benefit from in the field, and that is the fact that while we have these risks and we have these opportunities, they are not necessarily equally impacting all disputing parties. So let's take, just for an example, the fact that an arbitrator may choose to use a particular AI tool and say, I know this can be of use. It can assist in the particular part of the process in which I want to engage it, to assist in handling the dispute or handling the way I'm going to do an analysis for a decision. A mediator could be considering this when they're deciding a AI tool to assist with brainstorming, to assist with, as I said, the visualization or the management of potential outcomes for the disputants to consider as they're trying to negotiate to make a final decision for themselves. But not all the positive opportunities or the negative risks are equally distributed. And so this is something for us to consider both as practitioners, as teachers and educators and theorists and researchers, but also for us to be thinking about when we talk about governing AI. What does it mean to make an assumption that there is a benefit or there's a risk and not pay attention to the inequality about access to those experiences? So within our silos, as I mentioned, in the discipline of, let's say, dispute resolution, which what I would include court and ADR, until fairly recently, there has been an absolute dearth of engagement around issues regarding technology until the last 10 years or so. And that has slowly begun to change, but they continue to be almost entirely insufficient regarding AI. There are some that are beginning to be expressed with guidelines or recommendations on the ODR.info National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution website. We try to keep abreast of the standards and guidelines that are out there for the use of technology and dispute resolution in general, and also for those on AI. So you can find several of them there. And certainly if you are aware of others that we don't have listed, please be in touch with me and I'll be happy to post them. But within the silos, with the insufficiency of standards regarding data transparency, how AI impacts confidentiality and privacy, how it impacts accessibility, again, to increase accessibility, the benefits of harnessing it, the importance of attending to that by utilizing AI because it can increase accessibility, or the risks regarding inequality in accessibility, and of course, attention to machine learning and integration with other systems. And these are all relatively insufficient and have been, and it was one of the major reasons that we wanted to do some work on creating guardrails for AI. We wanted to protect against unequal procedural and substantive justice when AI was used. And if we think about the disputing parties as, in general, parties 1 and 2, and the human as the third party, and then technology as the fourth party, I want to introduce the idea of the fact that standards should be paying attention more and more to the fact that we really have fifth parties now at play. They are the software developers and the LLM architects who are becoming gatekeepers to access to justice. Many of us in the profession are pulling off the shelf a tool that we may use in another part of our life, a scheduling tool, a case management tool, a video conferencing system, just as an example, that we think is very useful and we plug and play. But in actuality, those that have collected the data and created a room in which that data bounces up against each other and then produces algorithmic information that can be of potential assistance to us, but also creates hallucinations, was not developed with the ODR standards in mind. And therefore, it's something for us to consider as we're, again, certifying mediators, arbitrators, and considering the guardrails that are needed. I think we would argue that market forces and good intentions have been insufficient. We have over 70 years now of people experimenting in one form or another with AI, and we are in the place that we're in, which is both incredibly exciting and also raises high risks, and they're not equal. So therefore, there's a necessity for ethical application of AI to any form of dispute resolution. And the standards would need to address transparency about, again, what's the level of reliance we'd have on AI, and what's the level of reliance we'd have on humans, and what kind of oversight and accountability is necessary. So the goal was to create, as part of a larger governance ecosystem, ODR standards that included AI, that followed this disruptive nature, but it followed it across the silos that are typically there when there's a development of a particular type of standard. They needed to be thin enough to be relevant across each of these silos, and also to be integratable with other governance mechanisms that exist that are appropriate inside and accepted inside different jurisdictions. So very briefly, I'll just point to the history of the development of ODR standards and where we are now with AI included in them. In 1998, the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution came up with the idea under Ethan Katch and Janet Rifkin of ODR, and it's really actually an international body with over 50 fellows from 6 continents. And in 2009, it issued the first set of ODR standards that began to be used immediately by ICANN in order to handle disputes over website addresses. So it made some impact immediately, although in many ways behind the scenes, for use internationally. And then in the mid 2000s, there was a lot of discussion in the UN, in the EU, about, for example, how to handle large volume, low value e-commerce disputes across jurisdictions. And in the end, after almost 8 years of negotiations internationally, one page of technical notes was developed, which of course is helpful, but was insufficient. And at that time, the center decided to issue a set of ethical principles that were values, they were not standards, in order to help stimulate further conversation about what the standards should be. In 2017, the center gave birth to a new organization, the International Council for Online Dispute Resolution, ICODR, which is a membership organization that you are all very welcome to join. And it updated the ODR standards based on the 2009 standards and the ethical principles from 2016. And then in May 2022, ICODR and the center revised the ODR standards by adding AI. And we were just ahead of the curve, so to speak, because it was only several months later that ChatGPT was released, about 6 months later. And the chatbot explosion meant so many people started experimenting with AI and dispute resolution. And certainly there was an explosion of disputes that arose because of it that help to feed the interest in how we might be able to use it productively and where we should be concerned. So I'm going to go over just 3 of the standards before I close. All of these you can find on the center website, odr.info, or the ICODR website. And each one is a paragraph or 2 that's specifically designed around the application of technology to dispute resolution. Under accountable, referencing AI, it says, this must include human oversight of the traceability of the originality of documents and the path to outcome when artificial intelligence is employed, and the determination of the relative control given to humans and artificial decision-making strategies and outcomes. Under equal, it says that the ODR system design must include proactive efforts to prevent AI from any AI decision-making function from creating or replicating or compounding bias. Under transparent, it highlights the fact that we must be transparent about the ways in which AI will be compliant with any jurisdictionally relevant regulation or legislation, or in their absence, the guidelines on transparency and fairness for the AI systems used. And then we've encouraged people to self-certify that they will follow the ODR standards. And that if they're an entity, a court, or housing a roster of arbitrators or mediators, that they will ask their participants who are dispute resolvers to self-certify. And the last point I want to just make before I close is the fact that we are incredibly excited to announce that in March, the International Standards Organization, which has at this point actually quite recently just shifted to 175 countries that have their national standards bodies as members, they have adopted the ODR standards that include AI in full, specifically for those that are going to handle dispute resolution services for e-commerce. So we sought to break the traditional pattern of standards development. We hope that the standards mirror AI's disruption of boundaries and that they illustrate that it can be a success to productively respond to the way in which AI disrupts boundaries of governance. And as already mentioned, I will put this in the chat in a moment, but if you're at all interested in the book, here's the discount code that is supposed to work until the end of the year, 72525. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leah. So do we have any questions or comments from anybody in the audience?
Yeah, I guess I might as well start the discussion going. As you know, standards are extremely useful, but a little more useful, one, if there's a way of proving you actually adhere to the standard by some certified organization, and some kind of trust model that says what happens when you don't adhere to the standard. And so far, none of that really exists from what I can see. And because a lot of it is based on self-certification, or I'm not quite sure how we get there at this point. Do you have any ideas?
I do. Strategic lawsuits. I mean, I think that there's really no the strategic lawsuits or mass arbitrations. I really don't see. Um, I do not see how anything changes without pain. I do not currently, with the current administration, see how we will actually have any thoughtful regulatory efforts within the next 3 to 5 years. I do not see how the next step, which is the level of uniformity accessible from typically insurance industry or those that are going to have some predictability in those penalties exists until we are more thoughtful and strategic in how we deliver how we deliver pain through the court system or through the through that side of the house. So again, I think that in the book I walk through a few areas where we could be looking. I think that our highest value dispute that should be had is programmers. Programmers in Silicon Valley are the only workers who have no idea what they're getting paid, right? Almost none of them have any idea what their options are worth. I was actually just talking to a cousin of mine who's weighing a few offers. They have no clue what they're getting paid. And that part is something right here, especially as you're starting to capture their essence. We're already seeing the damage in that industry, the damages in that industry of replicating their intellectual property that is to them personal. We're looking at other area, there's other areas in, where we have other areas that are finally starting to get some semblance. We just saw the court case where we're seeing character AI is voluntarily, disappearing from the market, rightly so. That is an issue of addiction and minor safety. We are now seeing age gating finally voluntarily coming as a result of those character AI lawsuits. I think we need to be very thoughtful as a community in our space of, instead of just trying to say, oh, well, the unauthorized practice of law, we should turn all technologies into saying, well, it's really working as a lawyer and attack that, which I don't think any of us actually, well, maybe someone on here does. I don't think is the best way to approach it, but there are going to be equivalents within our industry that are going to be, choke points that we can take into either court or arbitration that will actually spark that process. I don't know what else would do it.
Okay, but that seems like an approach that kind of ignores the complexity of the current problem for people practicing and using AI, which means, did I do something given the fragmented regulatory bodies around the world? Did I do something that violated some jurisdictions' compliance unknowingly, and I'm now being penalized? So
Well,
how
so
do I? Yeah.
I think we have a better answer for that too, actually, in there. And so in chapter two, I think in the absence in the absence of clear instruction of what the law should be, we do know what has been the past interpretation of acceptable risk and of acceptable damage relative to the likelihood of that damage. In there, when we talk about the thresholds we identify as ethical or unethical, those are representations of what petrochemical, aerospace, nuclear have accepted for decades that can be translated into rules of thumb within our industry. For example, by using these types of models, we can come up with rules of thumb that could be easily interpreted by the courts. For example, the 10% rule, which basically, if it takes a lawyer less than an hour to fix your mistake, that could happen 10% of the time, fine, that's ethical operation. If it takes half a week to fix it, you shouldn't be using that tool at all if it has a chance of occurring 1 in 10. And those types of relationships between what we've accepted for decades, applying them into our environment, I would argue is the responsible and ethical thing to do in the absence of this guidance. And I think if guidance comes in that is, counter for some reason to those, you at least have a justifiable protection for something that you've done in the absence of other clear guidance.
Well, I think one of the things that Bob is also saying is that there currently isn't an organization that has the authority to enforce any of the standards or any of the ethical guidelines. And
Mhm.
we've had this conversation over and over again about iCoder and the National Center. We simply don't have the bandwidth to do it. And I'm not sure where there is an organization that has the bandwidth to do it. And that's one of the reasons why I just sort of throw my hands up and say, if we're educating people well enough, maybe the market will help with this. Maybe the market will help, guide development and guide use. But you're absolutely right about the fact that there's no standards organization that's going to be able to say, "Hey, you crossed the line, and there's something we can do about it." I don't know of one.
I would also say that's why to us the ecosystem is so important because realistically, AI is moving so fast, technology in general, but AI in particular is moving so fast. And reaching agreement internationally, let alone inside a discipline in one jurisdiction, is always slower. And so is legislation, and so is the development of regulation. It's always slower. And so an ecosystem approach can give us more security, more protection, and will remain with loopholes and insufficiency. The other thing is that I think is exciting and also a really big challenge, especially when things are moving with such rapidity, is that I really think the field, since we're now talking about our field of dispute resolution, we are stakeholders and we should be paying attention to contributing to the conversation about public policy and legislation, regulation on this. And I think it's an enormous step that ISO took this on. Now, having thin standards about what's the lowest common denominator of what's acceptable is important. And the question is, will ODR providers who are challenged for not living up to them be thrown off a list inside each country? And obviously, that's up to a country to do that. But there is an active engagement in APEC, for example, to get APEC countries to sign up, moving beyond just guidelines around, they've also accepted in general the ODR standards, but to embed this in their regulatory system or in their policy system. So it's incremental, it's exciting, and there are tons of loopholes. And I think that's what we are grappling with. And it's a very important question when those of us are sticking our necks out and using AI in order to provide more access to justice are also then potentially vulnerable.
Well, you have a question or a comment. I'm going to suggest that this is going to be a transition for us because theoretically we're supposed to start the social hour a minute ago. So, Colin,
Well, I'm happy to put it in the social hour too.
no. Yeah, well, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting. It's funny. I think Bob, whatever he says always resonates with me because it's like we're using this and we're like, okay, how do we know if we're doing something wrong? Give us some guidelines. How can we prove? And I do think that, the beauty of the marketplace, again, being in Silicon Valley, I think cream rises. It becomes a competitive differentiator to be a business that can say, we abide by these standards. And over time, and that's kind of what we do with iCoder, right? And I see people are dropping off. So clearly I'm not the draw here. Everyone wants to go to the social hour. But the point I want to make is we have a tool called trustcloud.ai, and it's a console that you can put on your web page that shows all of the standards for like ISO 27001 or for SOC 2, and you can demonstrate compliance. And everyone who wants to prove that they're being compliant with the standard will update that table. And you can make it so that every ODR provider has an extension, which is like odr.com/compliance or odr.com/standards. And then you can say, okay, well, these are the standards that are agreed upon in the industry. And here's our proof, here's our documentation. We abide by those standards. Again, I think that's Bob's right. I mean, the notion that Chris said it's going to be strategic lawsuits or mass arbitrations, like, yikes, it's going to take a long time to hash all that out and cause the pain to get people to line up. But if we in the industry can take a proactive stance, and I look at the ODR.info provider list, the people who are self-certifying against ICOTR, we put it at the top. I mean, that's how we as an industry start to use these standards to hash through who's doing right and who's not doing right. I agree with Bob. As a provider, it's still a little murky for me, but that's a way that we can put a little wood behind the arrow to make these things happen.
Yeah, I would agree that the ecosystem or market-based standards tend to drive standards as a rule, especially in technology.
Yeah.
But again, we've been talking about the ethics of AI since 1942, since Isaac Asimov wrote Runaround, the 3 laws of robotics. So it may take a while before we get there.